Man, good to see everyone here this morning. My name is Kondo Simfukwe. I get to serve as a lead pastor here at Mission Point. And man, I'm thrilled to be gathered together in the house of the Lord with God's people. Looking forward to seeing what God wants to continue to do as he meets us here and as he impresses us one more time with Jesus Christ, compelling us there's nothing worth living for more than his son, Jesus Christ. Again, I want to say, as Tyler said, a special welcome to those of you who are guests with us. I cannot tell you how glad we are to have you with us this morning. We realize how absolutely difficult it can be to take the risky step of coming into a new church with people you've never met before and wondering what it would be like. What will the people be like? What will they say? Will they ask us to do strange stuff? Will the people be strange? We're kind of strange, but we won't ask you to do anything strange. So I just want to say thank you so much for venturing out and spending some time with us. Let me say really quickly before we move on, as a matter of hospitality, in fact, before we carry on, why don't you stand? We're going to ask you to move towards the middle of your row to make more room on the ends. And while you're doing that, why don't you just say a quick hello and a quick intro name exchange with the person next to you if you don't know who they are. And we will carry on here in just a moment. Follow each other on Twitter, friend each other on Facebook. All right, that's enough. Y'all took that too far. Too far. Man, listen, this is such a special morning for us here at Mission Point, and I'm so glad that you get to share it with us. This is definitely one of the most difficult mornings at Mission Point, and yet one of the most thrilling mornings here at Mission Point. I trust that's going to make sense to you here in a little bit. As many of you know, last Sunday we got to revel in and celebrate God's faithfulness to Mission Point for 4 years. We turned 4 last week. That was exciting stuff. Man, for us, as we looked back on the years, I just couldn't help but be absolutely astonished by the grace of God poured out on this church. His grace expressed in so many beautiful ways to us. First of all, his grace to wrestle down the resistance of 2 punk kids who wanted nothing to do with launching another church in an already over-churched county. But in God's grace, he convinced us that he wanted us to be a part of something that he's doing. I'm thankful for his grace that way. I'm thankful for his grace to compel and to stir in some of you this thought that, hey, we want to be a part of what's happening at Mission Point. That's just crazy still to us to this day. His grace to grow the church the way he's grown this church over the past 4 years has been absolutely astonishing to see. Frankly, the fact that I'm standing up here and saying we need y'all to scoot in so we can make room for people to sit on the outside, that's just astonishing. In fact, how many of you were here back in the Noah days of Mission Point? Look around. Keep your hands up. That's grace. As the Lord has continued to grow this church, and we are humbled by that. But mostly, I am humbled by the grace of God to keep us focused and fixated on the thing he called us to be and be about from the beginning. We're so aware of the idea that it is easy for churches to veer, to venture off from what the Lord has called them to be. And the Lord in his grace has kept us convinced that what matters more than anything is that we be a church unleashed, that we be a people who are compelled to take the hope of the gospel to the lost and the dying outside of these walls, that we not be a church that is obsessed with how many people sit in this room on a Sunday, but that we be obsessed with how many of the people sitting in this room are leaving these walls to go and share hope with those beyond it. that the Lord has kept us not so enamored and preoccupied with this little village called Mission Point. But man, he has compelled us to see beyond it to the kingdom that's called heaven. Not to fill Mission Point, but to do everything we can to fill heaven up for the sake of Jesus Christ. I'm so thankful for the grace of God to this church. This morning, we want to talk about something pretty difficult. Because for the sake of the mission, of seeing the lost, the broken, the dying come to a knowledge of Jesus Christ, the Lord has asked us something very difficult, something very costly. It's almost as though to start the year 2015, God has leaned into Mission Point and has asked us the question, oh really, you want to be about launching people from this point into the mission beyond the walls to see the broken, the dying, the lost come to a knowledge of Jesus Christ? Really, that's what you all want to be about. What about if I ask you to launch out one of your own leaders? Will you still be about what I called you to be about from the beginning? This is a difficult morning for us as we wrestle through a pretty hefty cost the Lord is asking us to pay. But this is also a thrilling morning. Because as a church, after 4 years, and even through grief and even through tears, we are still willing to say absolutely yes. Lord, if you call us to go out into the darkness, we will go. And if you call us to pay a certain price, we'll pay it. And if you ask us to give over certain people, certain things, we will say yes to you. So it's a thrilling thing. Not only to wrestle through the difficulty of what he's asking, but by his grace to still be able to say, yes, we will go. Yes, we will pay the price. And so sorry to do this, but kind of like a bad soap opera, I'm going to say stay tuned or tune back in. We're going to come back to that and share a little bit of the story that I'm referencing so you can get a sense of what the Lord is asking us to give up and to give over for the sake of his kingdom, for the sake of his mission. We'll come back to that here in a little bit. But before we talk about that cost, we want to spend a few minutes just being reminded of the glorious calling this church has been invited to chase. So if you have your Bibles, please meet me in Matthew chapter 5. If you don't have a copy of the scriptures, we're going to have the verses up here on the screens as well. But we want to just spend a few moments reflecting on a passage that has become so meaningful to who we are, who we believe God has called us to be as a church, what we believe he's called us to be about. Matthew chapter 5, and we're going to start reading at verse 13. We're going to read through verse 16. And here's what it says. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. We just celebrated the start of a new year, a really fascinating time in our culture. And for many of us, what happened was as we watched that big crystal ball fall out of the sky in New York, we almost envisioned our 2014s, whatever they held, being crushed beneath its weight, which gave us the opportunity to start afresh with a new and better 2015. You know, to reach for better, to reach for more, to press into a fuller year. And so whether you did this out loud or whether you did it on paper, or whether you shared it with somebody or whether you tweeted it, however you did it, many of us we etched resolutions. New Year's resolutions, as we love to call them. Here's a fascinating thing about resolution. I find this really interesting, that for most of us who ventured into the world of New Year's resolutions, those typically take on the verb form. New Year's resolutions tend to be things that we resolve to do in the upcoming year. Because if we do certain things, then surely our life will be propelled into a fuller version of whatever last year's life held. And so we make resolutions of things we intend to do, whether it's things we want to stop doing or do less, whether it's things we want to do more, or whether it's things we want to just do, period, maybe for the very first time. We resolve to do. Next week, we're going to start talking a little bit more about this. But by way of giving a glimpse and ramping into this passage, I find it thoroughly fascinating that when the scriptures speak to the idea of pressing in or reaching for a better, fuller version of life, when Jesus Christ is about to launch his followers into his work, into his mission, he doesn't start by telling them what to do. He starts by reminding them who and what they already are. We'll talk more about this next week, and I'm excited because here's the reality. If you believe and understand and embrace who you are, it will inevitably propel you to do the kinds of things that push you into the fuller version of life. It's that will bring us into a better 2015. And so in launching his followers into the mission, Jesus wants them to know, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. I love this personally because here's the thing about when Jesus tells you something that you are, if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, he's not particularly concerned about your opinion. He's not asking you how you feel about what he declares you to be. He's not necessarily even asking for your cooperation, because the truth is, no matter what you do or don't do, you still are what he says you are. And in this particular case, he says you are the salt of the earth. In an era where there were no refrigerators, salt was used to preserve food, to prevent it from decaying. It was what prevented food from rotting. Second law of thermodynamics were pushed back a little bit on account of salt. Salt was also used to bring some flavor to what would otherwise be bland food. And what Jesus is announcing to his followers is, listen, whatever salt is to food, you are to the earth. His insinuation is very clear, that the world in which we live is decaying and it's dull. And you are my means of pushing back the deteriorating effects of sin. You are my means of bringing color and flair and flavor to a world that is otherwise meaningless and purposeless. And you don't have to look far to verify the reality that the world is decaying and the world is dull. You don't have to look far to see another marriage claimed. You don't have to look far to find middle school students experimenting in destructive patterns. You don't have to look far to see addiction wrestling people to the ground, taking them down this spiral towards destruction. You don't have to look far to see people who are wrapped up in poverty and who can't manage to put food on the table. Their lives are deteriorating. And what Jesus is saying is, you are heaven's preservative. You are the ones who are called to push back the deterioration. You are the ones who are called to bring some flair to people at your work and people in your home and people in your school who otherwise are reaching and searching for anything lasting, anything meaningful, because everything they chase after loses its flair and its taste after a while, and they're wondering, does anything last? Because life seems meaningless and dull. And Jesus says, you are the colorers of their dull world. You are the flavor of heaven brought into a meaningless world. It's who you are. Now, the fascinating thing is, if this is who you are, there's nothing you can do to change that. It is who you are. Tough, sorry, but you can miss it. You can ignore it, which I fear is so often the plight of the church. You can be painfully aware of somebody you work with who is wrestling and marriage is just deteriorating, and you're just too busy about your business. And so you don't enter in to be who you are, to push back the effects of sin a little bit. You can be aware of people in your world who are struggling with addiction, but you just stand by and do nothing to flavor, nothing to push back the effects of evil. We can be aware of people in our community who are hungry, and we just don't do anything. We ignore who we are, and we sit back and not live up to what Jesus Christ says we are called to be. You are the salt of the earth. I can't tell you how much that has influenced us as a church. That's why we are constantly looking for excuses. Lord, where is sin doing its most decaying work in our community? Show us the people who are hungry. Show us the people who are homeless. Show us the people who are abused, who can't speak for themselves. Because if we are to be salt, then we want to be very salty and bring preservation and bring flavor to a decaying and dying world. And this year more than ever, we want to be salty. Not salt-ish and useless, because we're sitting behind the scenes ignoring the hurt, the deterioration in our world, but we want to be who He's called us to be more and more. And He also says you are the light of the world. And man, in an era where there was no electricity, that picture would have been plain. Lamps and lanterns are the way people knew where they were. It is what prevented people from getting lost. It enabled people to see where they were going. And Jesus' insinuation is very clear. The world around you is dark and dying. There are people who are lost apart from a relationship with Jesus Christ, and they are heading towards certain destruction. And the worst effects of darkness is that they have no idea that that is the reality they're in. They can't even see it. 2 Corinthians 4 says the God of this age has blinded their eyes and their minds so they cannot see the light, which is the gospel, which is the person of Jesus Christ. And the reality, you don't have to look far to find thousands of people in our own city, at your own work, in your own school, in your own sports teams who are dying apart from Christ, steeped in darkness. And Jesus says, thankfully, though, you are light. You are the mouthpieces of hope in the gospel. Whether you ever shared the gospel with somebody or not. In fact, some of us sitting in this room did not share it once with anybody last year. You are still light. You are just terrible light. You are just this light that's covered over, hogging from people who are in darkness and dying apart from Jesus Christ. You can't change the fact that you're light, but you can ignore it and you can hide it. And I fear that is the plight of the church, particularly in the Western culture. We gather together under this bowl called the local church. We come to this building and we get really bold and we get really bright and we get really unveiled and we sing about Jesus is the last word and he's worthy of this, that, and the other. But when we leave this building, we shut the light back down and we don't share hope with anybody in the world around us, ignoring that we are, in fact, light, and light is supposed to shine. Voices are supposed to be raised. Hope is supposed to be spoken to the people in the world around us. It's what we are, salt and light. And as a church, we really want to say now more than ever, from the moment we launched, and now more than ever, we want to say, Jesus, if you have said the church is by nature salt and is by nature light, then we want to flavor the world around us with your love, and we want to push back evil wherever we find it. And if we are light, then more than ever, we want to be unveiled, and we want to raise our voices, and we want to offer hope to those in darkness so that we can invite them to the ultimate light of the world, Jesus himself. And so I can't tell you how excited we are for what this year holds for us, the ways we want to be more of what he's called us to be. It doesn't start with us saying, go, do. It starts with us saying, man, do we understand who we are? And are we willing to be about what he says we are? And that's the question the Lord has asked us in the last few weeks as a church. Oh, really? So you want to play whatever part you can to be a point from which people are launched into the darkness to carry the light. Really? Yep. And you want to be salt that does whatever you can to push back the deteriorating effects of sin. Yes, that's great. What if I ask for you to launch out one of your own leaders? Will you still be about that? Is that still who you believe I've called you to be? And that's the question we've had to answer. And so, as many of you have probably heard by now, Abe Hepler, one of the founding members of Mission Point, is being called by the Lord out of his vocational role at Mission Point into an area of darkness to carry light. Into an area that's deteriorating to be salt. And man, we've had to, as a church, wrestle through that. Are we still willing to say yes? And so what we want to do is kind of take some time. I'm going to have Abe and Matt come out. And we're going to just spend some time chatting with Abe, kind of getting a sense of what the Lord has been calling him to, what the Lord is asking of him. And just to hear pieces of his story, and really what I hope that we'll see, and that when it's all said and done, we'll answer the question, are we willing to be what he calls us to be wherever he sends us, to be light, to be salt?